I almost said the gospel according to St. Matthew as I was reading the gospel today. We've been reading through the Gospel of Matthew in our weekly readings, and of course also enjoying all the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs. And that will continue next week. But today we interrupt this sequence of readings for a word from our sponsor, the church, who in its wisdom set up feast days that commemorate various points in the life of Jesus. Today is the feast of the Transfiguration, and I realized as we were doing the readings that I'm wearing the wrong color, that we should all be in white, but I always forget. In our present culture, most of our holidays are like national holidays, like the 4th of July, or Memorial Day, or Labor Day, which is coming up, right, next month. And of course, we celebrate Christmas and Easter too. But the Feast of the Presentation, or the Feast of the Annunciation, it's not something we usually celebrate unless it happens to fall on a Sunday. I always thought it was ironic that I grew up in a Muslim country, and there, Ascension Day was a holiday because the Muslims also believe that Jesus ascended. But here, we hardly celebrate it at all. But for the medieval church, every holiday was based on a holy day, centered on Jesus, Mary, or one of the saints. One summer in college, I was in France, and we soon discovered that the banks were all closed on Saint Days. And it seemed that there was at least one Saint Day sometime in the middle of the week. So we finally picked up a French calendar so that we could be forewarned. For the church, these feasts are opportunities for special devotion and also for teaching. Feast days commemorate God's intervention into human history. And although what they celebrate occurred long ago, they still can have significance for us today. So, since this year the Transfiguration falls on a Sunday, let us do as Peter suggests. Let us build shelters, spend some time at this amazing site, and appreciate the treasure it holds. We hike up the mountain with Jesus, Peter, James, and John. And I'm sure Mother Terry could tell us exactly what that is like. I'm sweating, but the terrain is rough, and they probably follow something that looks like a sheep trail up the slope. And you probably have some great pictures of what that looks like. What was going on through the disciples' minds as they climbed up with Jesus? Jesus often went up the mountain alone to pray. Like Moses, he met God there. Moses sometimes took his assistant Joshua with them, so perhaps they were thinking that they might have a promotion in the group of disciples. What were they going to learn from Jesus in this deserted place? What were they going to see? Fresh in their minds was Peter's declaration of Jesus being the Messiah. And then Jesus' strange words about dying and rising again. Peter had been quick with his criticism of Jesus' game plan, and Jesus finally had to tell him very strongly that he should stop, that he did not know what he was talking about. I think I would have had a lot of questions to ask Jesus as we climb up this mountain. But after Jesus' stunning rebuke of Peter, I probably would not be asking any of them. I would be too nervous. We pause at the top to catch our breath. And suddenly something is happening to Jesus. His face shines. His clothes become dazzling white. And before we can rub our eyes, we see Elijah and Moses talking with Jesus. Wow, this is it. Real Messiah stuff. New and improved may be a selling point for many things, but not when it comes to religion. Throughout the gospel, there's always allusions to the Old Testament prophecies and shadowing of Old Testament events. And here it is clearly shown. Jesus is not touting some newfangled religion. He is in line with God's plan for God's people throughout the ages. He is the fulfillment of Moses' promise that the Lord will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. In fact, the Old Testament ends with the prophet Malachi predicting the coming day of the Lord, which will bring judgment to the wicked and healing to the righteous. His closing words are, "Remember the teaching of Moses my servant, and lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before this great and terrible day that the Lord comes." So for Peter, James, and John, this was a historical moment come true. Mountains and clouds. Does this conjure up the picture of God on Mount Sinai calling Moses up to receive the 10 Commandments? We read this morning how when Moses came down out of the mountain, his face was still shining as Jesus' face does now. And Elijah, when Jezebel threatened to kill him after his showdown with the prophets of Baal, he flees to Mount Horeb. There he witnesses a terrifying wind, an earthquake, and a fire. But it is only after the great display of nature that he feels God's presence in the silence which follows. God commissions him to anoint Hazael as king of Aram, Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha as his successor. All three people were nobodies before their anointing, but they would bring upheaval to their time. Elijah certainly had credentials for confirming the Messiah. In this historical moment, Peter suggests the appropriate action. Let us build dwellings for you and Elijah and Moses. It would enable these heavenly beings to remain, at least for a while, a place to come back to, and a place to commemorate them once they left. With the backing of Moses and Elijah, surely now everybody would want to join their cause. Once again, Peter misunderstands God's plan. Because as much as we are in awe of the holy visitors, it is not them who are the focus, but their message. With mounting fear and awe, the disciples realize that the cloud has descended over them. Remember that pillar of cloud which led the Israelites, the rumbling clouds over Mount Sinai? This could be nothing but the presence of God. They hear a voice. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. Terrified, they fall face down on the ground. And then they feel a touch on their shoulder. Get up, Jesus tells them. Don't be afraid. They look up. The sun is shining. Jesus is alone. More than that, they have heard the voice of God and lived. Wow. No wonder they don't tell anybody at that time. Who would have believed them? This is my son, my chosen. God repeats the words from Jesus' baptism. But at that time, it was more of a private moment of affirmation between the Trinity. The crowd of people probably just saw a dove, probably just heard thunder. But Jesus heard the words and knew that he was claimed by God and commissioned. And thus began the journey of transforming innocence into holy character. We call it sanctification. Sanctification isn't easy. It would be nice if we just got a landslide of holiness from heaven at baptism and could do everything perfectly after that, but we don't. Sanctification needs to be tested. It needs to grow. As Jesus walked through his earthly ministry, he revealed what a life totally dedicated to God should be, and he grew in sanctification. The Transfiguration comes at the peak of Jesus' ministry. Right before this, Peter made his declaration that Jesus was the Messiah. And it is at this point, at the peak of his success as a popular prophet, that Jesus begins to speak about his death. No cross, no crown, the saying goes, but for Jesus, the crown, the glory that we saw at the Transfiguration, came before the cross. Without the Transfiguration, the cross would be no more than a cross of a martyr, someone who ended up on the wrong side of the political powers that be. But in the Transfiguration, we see the cross was part of God's plan. At the Transfiguration, Jesus was once again in the position of glory. If he ascended into heaven right then, we probably still would have remembered him as a wonderful teacher and prophet. But he didn't. He came down the mountain to the restless crowd, the hapless disciples, and the distraught Father. He came down from the mountain knowing it was the road to the cross. The Transfiguration is a divine revelation about who Jesus is. So what is our response? Even as we take the time to enjoy the richness of this passage, we need to remember Christianity is not a spectator sport. Rather, the voice commanded, listen to him. It is hard to listen at times. It was hard for the disciples to understand Jesus' predictions of his upcoming arrest. And how do they respond? With arguments about who was the greatest. It is only after Jesus was raised and they remembered the Transfiguration that they could understand what sort of glory God was revealing. Then this experience made sense. Then they could talk about it. Jesus' earthly ministry gave us an example of a life dedicated to God. His death and resurrection gives us the power to live that life as well. And now God sends us where God sent God's Son. There are moments when that glory does shine through and we know without a shadow of a doubt, God is with us and this place is holy. But we are not to stay there. We must return to the challenges of the world. In Jesus' name. It is not easy work, but it is holy work. And it is our work.